I will say a few things about responsible research assessment in general, the discussion about responsible research assessment, the policy initiatives, and then I will move to open research information, making the argument that open research information is something that is essential if we want to make research assessment more responsible. And I'm going to look at open research information in three different ways: infrastructures in general, then one kind of specific infrastructure initiative, the so-called open knowledge base that is being discussed in my country, in the Netherlands. And then at a more kind of a governance level, the idea of having guiding principles to help all of us to move in the direction of more openness in our research information, in our infrastructures. And in the Netherlands, we have had quite some discussion about that, and I will share something with you about this. And finally, I will draw a few conclusions and recommendations. So that's the plan. So let me start by saying a few things about responsible research assessment. So responsible research assessment is a development that has become more and more prominent over the past, I would say, past 10 years or so. What you see on this slide is two early initiatives that were taken, the so-called Declaration on Research Assessment that you see here at the left, which I believe was published in 2013, so that's almost 10 years ago now. At the right, you see the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. It's a statement of which I'm one of the co-authors. Both initiatives you can see as a kind of advocacy initiatives. These were early initiatives pushing for change in the way research assessment is done. And change in those cases meant to reduce the reliance of research assessment on quantitative metrics, bibliometrics, and instead to provide more space, more opportunities for research assessment that takes into account what is sometimes called qualitative expert judgment, the broader context, so not just one thing, not just publications in journals and the citations they receive, but all kinds of other things that we may feel are important in research. So much more room for context, much more room for also recognizing diversity in the way research is done, diversity, for instance, between disciplines. So these are some of the key ideas that these initiatives are promoting. Also, of course, the idea of being transparent in how assessment is done, enabling people that are being assessed to also kind of challenge, perhaps, the criteria that are used for the assessment. So this was about 10 years ago, this development started. The interesting thing is that over these 10 years, there has been a shift from kind of advocacy initiatives to actual policy making taking place now, and pushing for and implementing responsible research assessment. So here I show three of these developments. So at the left, you see what is called Room for Everyone's Talent. It's something in the Netherlands, a program at the country level that all universities are supporting, where the way recognition and rewards of academics is organized, is being reformed. So in the past, recognition and rewards was very much centered around articles in journals, bibliometric parameters for these articles. And this is now at the moment being reformed, and there's much more room now for taking into consideration a diversity of different types of contributions that academics make, and giving recognition to all these different types of contributions. So in the middle, you see a statement, a position statement by the European University Association and Science Europe, who also are clearly pushing for this agenda of reforming research assessment. And at the right, you see an initiative taken by the European Commission, who is building a coalition of organizations in Europe that agreed to work together to push for change in research assessment practices. This is definitely not exhaustive. There are many more things going on, but this gives a kind of a flavor of the types of things that are happening right now. One more, perhaps, that I should mention is the UNESCO. So they published quite recently their recommendation on open science. Open science, of course, is not entirely the same thing as responsible research assessment, but there are all kinds of interesting and also really important connections. And that is also made visible in this UNESCO recommendation. So UNESCO argues in its recommendation that there's a need to review rethink research assessment, evaluation systems, in order to make sure that they are aligned with open science principles. They also write in the recommendation that there's a need to change research assessment practices, research evaluation practices in such a way that proper recognition is given to a diversity of research outputs, but not only outputs, also activities, missions of research or research teams. So again, it's the same idea of broadening the scope of what is taken into consideration in research assessment, being more open to a diversity of outputs and activities in a disciplinary sense, but for instance also in the sense of geographical diversity. So for instance, questioning whether everything should always be in English, things like that. So what we see, of course, is that in many places still nowadays, but even more a few years ago, bibliometric parameters, publication counts, citation counts have been highly influential in how research assessment is done. That's also kind of what all these reform initiatives are pushing against. So they say that's actually not the right way of doing it. We need to move away from an over-reliance on these types of quantitative parameters. At the same time, of course, most of these initiatives also recognize, fortunately, I believe, that there is value. There's value, not, of course, in over-relying on one or two quantitative parameters, but there's value in having systematic information to guide research assessment and to make sure that all kinds of relevant outputs, activities are properly taken into consideration. And once you have this systematic information, there is a question like, how can that information best be brought into an assessment process? And often we call this research analytics, or sometimes we say research intelligence, as the kind of a way of systematically making information available to evaluators and to assessment processes. And I feel that if we want research assessment to be responsible, while still recognizing the importance of all kinds of systematic information that can be used to support and facilitate research assessment, if we want to move in this direction, there are three key things that we need to be aware of, and three key kind of values that we need to consider. First, I think that research analytics, and analytics can be numbers, can be numerical metrics, but it can also be all kinds of other ways in which information is made available. Perhaps in a visual way, perhaps in a dashboard, you can think of all kinds of ways, but it needs to be transparent. So it needs to be clear what is actually being presented to someone. And in the end, someone also needs to be able to see what is behind this number, or what's behind this dashboard, what's the underlying data. So that's transparency, which is essential. It's essential because transparency enables you to have a conversation about the information that is used to support research assessment, a conversation about what that information may actually mean, how it might be interpreted. There's a need for pluralism. So pluralism is basically what is needed to enable this diversity that is needed. So recognizing the diversity of different things that happen in the research system, different types of outputs, different types of activities, different missions that different research units have. And to do justice to that diversity, we need research analytics that are pluralistic. So not just one thing, not just counting publications or citations. There can be many other things that may need to be taken into consideration. So that's this pluralism. And then third, we need research analytics that are democratic. And democratic essentially means for me that everyone involved in research assessment, those who are doing the assessment, those who are being assessed, everyone involved should ultimately have access to the same information, so that we can all, from an equal playing field, we can discuss what that information means, without some of us being kind of in a position where we know more, we have more access to information than others. Because then, of course, you don't have this equal playing field that enables a truly kind of equal democratic type of discussion about how assessment is done. So these are kind of the ideals that I think we need to strive for if we want to make research assessment more responsible, and we want to have research analytics that support and facilitate this. The key point is that if we want to go in this direction, the only way I believe to do this is to have open research information. So research information needs to be open if we want to have analytics that are transparent, pluralistic, and democratic, and that enable responsible research assessment. So sometimes people have all this discussion about responsible research assessment, but also about open science. There's two kind of main important developments taking place right now at the policy level. And I think we need to have a proper understanding of how these two can relate to each other and also how they can strengthen each other. So one thing that people often discuss is the possibility or even the need for research assessment to give recognition and reward to open science practices in order to enable researchers to actually adopt these practices. If we don't give recognition to researchers that adopt open science practices, then you cannot really expect researchers to do it. That's the argument people make. There's also an arrow that points in the other direction, and that's the one that I would like to focus on today. If we want research assessment to be made more responsible, then, as I mentioned on the previous slide, research information should be made more open, should be made available in more open ways. So essentially, the way we work with research information should itself be compatible with principles of open science. And that's the kind of the idea that I want to focus on today. I go back one more time to the UNESCO recommendation, because actually the same idea can also be found in the UNESCO recommendation. So they make a call for research information systems for bibliometric and scientific analysis to be more open. And they link that indeed to assessment practices. And that's basically also the line of reasoning that I will follow today. So I'm first going to say a few things about developments that are going on, and I guess that some of you, perhaps many of you, are familiar with at least some of these developments, so I will quickly go through them. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just to give you kind of a flavor of the direction in which things are moving. So I'm going to focus first on open infrastructures that offer research information. Let me just mention a few things that I think are important and that are going on or that have been going on over the past few years. So citation data has been made openly available thanks to the Initiative for Open Citations, which has been extremely successful actually in pushing for this form of openness. Many publishers make citations available in an infrastructure that is called Crossref, the infrastructure that also is used for registering DOIs for articles. Publishers make these citations or the reference lists of articles, they make them available in Crossref. This data used to be closed, but over the past few years, this initiative has pushed for openness of all that data, and basically all the data is now openly available, which I believe is very important because this enables the transparency that I mentioned before. So if you use citation data, and I still think citation data is valuable, is important, although we should not rely too much on this type of data. But if you use it, then nowadays you can use it in a transparent way. So people cannot just use citation-based statistics, indicators, metrics, but people can also see what is behind it. We can kind of build stories about what all these citations tell us. What is actually the specific type of impact, for instance, that these citations demonstrate. That's great. That's an important development. Open Abstract has been a similar development. I've been involved in this myself as coordinator of this initiative for open abstracts. So it's pushing for abstracts of research articles to be made openly available, not just being freely available on the website of a journal, but being openly available in well-structured infrastructures like the infrastructure provided by Crossref. So many publishers, they are shown in orange here, they have all moved towards openness of abstracts. Unfortunately, there are also still publishers that have not yet moved in that direction, in particular the big commercial publishers. So that's a bit disappointing. And again, this is important. Abstracts are, for instance, used when you look at lots of statistics that are being produced around sustainable development goals. They often rely on doing text mining in the abstracts of scientific articles. As long as these abstracts are not made openly available, all these analytics around SDGs, they are kind of based on closed data, and in that sense, they are not really enabling responsible research assessment. Research organization registry, it's a kind of a new identifier for organizations, like we have ORCID identifiers for individual researchers. Another key development, I believe. Funding data, so who is actually funding the research? There again, we have the same question about the openness. So we see that publications typically have acknowledgements where they acknowledge their funder, but often that data is not openly available. So we recently did some studies to kind of compile statistics on the level of openness of this data. And again, we see that it depends on the publisher. So some publishers make this data openly available, others do not. Proprietary databases like Web of Science and Scopus then typically do have the data, but for some reason publishers have chosen not to make it openly available, which I think again is a problem from the viewpoint of ultimately supporting and enabling responsible research assessment. These are dashboards that Crossref, this infrastructure where a lot of this open data, open metadata is made available. That dashboard that Crossref provides. So here you can see how different publishers are performing. So we see Royal Society at the left, they're doing an excellent job in terms of making all this metadata openly available. At the right, you see the American Psychological Association, and unfortunately their performance is really poor. So lots of data they don't make available, which is a clear obstacle actually to creating research analytics that are based on open data and that enable responsible assessment. So my argument is that all this metadata around publications and also around other types of outputs needs to be made openly available. So we often ask for publications to be open access, but actually we should ask for publications to be fair. Just like we want data to be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, actually the same applies, I believe, or the same should apply to publications. Publications should not only be accessible and reusable, so that's what typically the open access movement is pushing for, but they should also be findable and interoperable, and that requires all this metadata to be made openly available. There are discussions of pit graphs, persistent identifiers, and connecting all these persistent identifiers. So I already mentioned ORCID IDs, I mentioned ROR IDs, Research Organization, Registry IDs, DOIs. So there are more and more of these persistent identifiers, and this enables us to build infrastructures, open infrastructures that show how all kinds of entities are related to each other, are linked to each other. And the nice thing also is that these pit graphs are kind of easy to extend, and that is important because if we want to do justice to the diversity of research outputs and research activities, we should make sure that the infrastructures that we build are not organized just around traditional research articles, but that they can be extended more and more to also cover other types of outputs and activities. And pit graphs seem to be a promising way of doing that. I will skip this one just in the interest of time. This is another interesting report, actually, making fairer assessments possible, which is also very much promoting many of these ideas. So you may want to take a look at that. It's again the idea of building all these infrastructures to enable better ways of doing research assessments and making sure that all these infrastructures also provide open research information. I'm going to say very briefly something about developments in the Netherlands, my own country, about an initiative that has been taken to explore the possibility of building a so-called open knowledge base for research information in the Netherlands. This is an initiative that is still in an early stage of development, and there's still a significant degree of uncertainty about the direction in which this will move. So that's also why I will keep the discussion relatively brief. So this started a few years ago. It was also kind of linked to negotiations in the Netherlands between the universities and Elsevier. There was a kind of a sense of uneasiness, like all these agreements that we make with big publishers, and in particular with Elsevier, are they really kind of going to be helpful for the Dutch research system, or are there also kind of important threats that we should be aware of? Threats, for instance, about related to the way in which all kinds of data that we make available to a publisher like Elsevier, data that is also incorporated in many of the information tools, information products that Elsevier offers, the way that data is absorbed by these systems, and perhaps the way in which we run the risk of losing the ownership in some sense of that data. So that led to all these discussions about the possibility of building an open knowledge base for open research information in the Netherlands, which could potentially be a countrywide collaborative initiative in which all the universities could participate, but also other relevant organizations. In the meantime, a few studies have been done to kind of explore in more detail what this might look like, a feasibility study. At the right is a report that summarizes a workshop that I was also myself involved in as one of the organizers. So quite a lot of thinking has been done, and many stakeholders have participated in all these discussions. So this has led to some preliminary ideas on what an open knowledge base could be. So at the left, you see on this slide, you see kind of the current situation that we have in the Netherlands, which I guess is quite similar to Germany. So each institution has its own CRIS system. We have subscriptions to databases, many of them proprietary, and we try to link all these systems to each other in order to get the information that we need, for instance, for assessment purposes. At the right, you see one way in which such an open knowledge base might be organized. So this kind of emerged from some of these discussions that took place in the Netherlands and this feasibility study. So what you see here is you see again these CRIS systems at the institutions. These CRIS systems could feed into this open knowledge base. At the same time, the open knowledge base could benefit from all kinds of open infrastructures like the ones that I mentioned. And these could also provide all kinds of valuable information to be used and to be incorporated in this open knowledge base. And then all kinds of analytics could be produced based on that openly available information in this open knowledge base. While at the same time, this open knowledge base could also enrich what is already available at the different institutions in the local CRIS systems. So that's at a very high level, that's kind of the philosophy of this open knowledge base. This goes into a little bit more detail. I probably should not discuss this in detail, but it shows some of the discussions that have been going on about different layers in which you first at the top have CRIS systems at the institutional level. These CRIS systems could feed into a more central system, perhaps something to be called a warehouse, that would be at the level of our country. The Netherlands would bring a lot of valuable, important data and information together. You could think of having all kinds of curation steps or harmonization, enrichment, deduplication. So that's kind of the difference between raw data and harmonized data. And ultimately, of course, there are questions about tools, analytics, dashboards that can be built on top of that. And also whether something like that, these tools should be seen as part of such an open knowledge base, or whether this is more something that other actors in the system could perhaps build on top of such an open knowledge base. So that's the discussion we have been having. Different models have been proposed. Kind of the perhaps least ambitious model is kind of a model that focuses on standardizing all kinds of APIs, so standardizing the way in which different systems can exchange data. A somewhat more ambitious model is the warehouse model, where data is really actually brought together in a more centralized type of system. And this so-called research environment model goes one step further and also kind of aims for services and tools to be made part of that system. These discussions are ongoing, so at the moment I cannot really report on any definitive steps that have been taken in the Netherlands or decisions that have been made. It's ongoing at the moment, as we speak, basically. So this is just where we are right now in the Netherlands. I want to conclude by briefly saying something about the need to also think very carefully about questions more at the governance level. So what I just showed you is very much infrastructure in the sense of data that is made openly available, organizations that take care of these initiatives that push for this type of openness. But there are really essential questions about governance behind all of this, governance and kind of responsible use of research information. So in the Netherlands, what has happened is that 7 guiding principles for open research information have been formulated, which are becoming increasingly influential in how in the Netherlands we kind of together approach all these questions about how we deal with research information, how we organize infrastructures. So I will quickly go through these 7 guiding principles to give you kind of a flavor of the direction in which we are moving. So this is the document that I think can be found on Zenodo. So my colleague Sarah de Rijken at my own center is one of the authors of this document, but it's a document that has resulted actually from a collaboration in which a number of different stakeholders in the Netherlands were active. So what you see here, it's the first 3 principles. So the first one is trusted and transparent provenance. So the idea is that whenever we have information, or let's call it metadata about research outputs, research activities, we also should make sure that we have high quality provenance for this metadata. So this provenance tells us when the data was created, was obtained, who created the data. So this provenance enables us to kind of understand whether the data is reliable, whether the data is up to date, these types of things. So high quality provenance is essential. Without high quality provenance, it's kind of questionable whether the data will be of much use. Number 2, openness of metadata. Well, that one is, I guess, kind of obvious in the light of all the discussions that we have now had. Openness of algorithms, so that's of course the other side. It's not just about the data, but also about the algorithms that process the data and that kind of enrich the data, that create analytics, indicators, metrics. So there again, the openness is important to make sure that we ultimately are able to have analytics that meet these requirements that I mentioned, being transparent, being pluralistic, being democratic. The next one, principle 4, enduring access and availability. So that's the idea that we should make sure that we have this proper metadata with provenance, metadata that's open. We should have it not just right now, but we should also have guarantees that this will remain available in the future. Because this is essential data. Our research system kind of depends on this data being available also in the future. So we need to make sure that the data doesn't get kind of locked into systems that are closed, or systems where you cannot really get the data out of the system if at some point you want to move to a different system. So this is an important thing, preventing all kinds of undesirable logins. Open standards and interoperability. So this is the idea that it is kind of naive to think of to imagine the possibility of creating one single solution, one single database infrastructure that is going to contain all the information, all the data that we need. That's not how it will work. You will always, in some sense, have a system that is kind of decentralized, at least to a certain degree, where different infrastructures, different data sources are kind of connected to each other and mutually enrich each other. But this only works if, of course, these different data sources are interoperable, if the data can be exchanged between the different data sources, if there are standards that kind of describe how certain things are captured in the data. So that's why principle 5 is so important. Principle 6, open collaboration with third parties. This principle states that there should be room for a diversity of actors to contribute to having this all this open research information. A diversity of actors, which for instance may also include commercial actors. We know, of course, that in many cases people, organizations feel a bit uneasy about commercial actors being part of all of this, in particular, of course, because they may have motivations that partly do not align with some of these principles that we are promoting here. The idea, however, is that there should be room also for such actors in the system, because they do bring certain things that perhaps other actors cannot bring that easily, like, for instance, the ability to innovate in a kind of rapid, flexible way. However, the important thing is that this collaboration should be done in an open manner, this collaboration between different types of actors in an open manner, where there is room for innovation, for competition, but where also these important public values are recognized and respected. Finally, number 7, academic sovereignty through governance. This is basically a kind of overarching principles which says that if we take all of this seriously, if we believe that all these principles need to be safeguarded in some way, then it is important to have in place some kind of governance structure that is continuously kind of managing this process where all the different stakeholders in this case, the Dutch research system, where they are making their contributions to this world of open research information, but where, of course, at some point there will be kind of tensions. There may be conflicts between different stakeholders. There may be stakeholders that perhaps behave in ways that deviate from these principles. And then you need to have a governance mechanism to kind of correct for these types of situations and to handle these tensions. So that's the 7 principles that at the moment in the Netherlands are kind of helping us to make sure that we make the right decisions in how we deal with all these complex questions about openness of research information, metadata, etc. It's not easy, but these principles provide high-level guidance that we all try to take into consideration. So I basically would like to end here. So let me just kind of summarize some conclusions and recommendations. So I hope I made a convincing point that if we take seriously this movement towards more responsible research assessment, if you're all serious about this, then we need to recognize that open research information is a crucial element in that development. So I don't think it's possible to make research assessment really fundamentally more responsible in the way that I discussed, if research information remains closed, if it's mainly taken from proprietary data sources that don't make the data openly available, but data sources that are also closed in the sense of kind of being owned and governed by commercial actors. So we need to move towards open research information. It's essential. This then implies that the infrastructures that are already, at least to some extent, in place and that provide open research information, we should make sure that we optimally benefit from what these infrastructures offer, but we should also actively support the further development of these infrastructures. So we should support advocacy initiatives that, for instance, try to convince publishers to become more open. So I said a few things about this metadata that still is quite often closed, unfortunately. But we should also consider supporting number of infrastructures that are in place, but that often have very limited budgets. So providing financial support to these infrastructures is definitely something that I think we all need to consider. So make sure that you support these developments, if indeed you are serious about reforming research assessment practices. And finally, these guiding principles. I think that's what is needed and what is quite essential, because this is a very complex space and it is quite easy to make kind of mistake, to make a decision that seems innocent, seems kind of okay, but ultimately at some point in the longer term you discover that you have ended up in a kind of problematic, unfortunate situation, but then it's kind of too late. So these guiding principles are meant to help all of us to make sure that we stay focused on going in the right direction, staying on track. And I think it's essential to have something like that. Thank you for your attention.